The colder the winter, the further Leila Voss pushed everyone away, and in Haida Gwaii, the winters came in hard and stayed long. She had chosen the island for exactly that reason. Accessible only by ferry or floatplane, tucked off the northern coast of British Columbia, where the Pacific turned iron grey from October through March, it was the kind of place that filtered out the people who didn't really mean it. Tourists came in July with their cameras and their questions. By November, they were gone. What stayed was the rain, the ravens, and the silence Leila had been chasing since she left the Canadian Forces 2 years ago. Her place sat at the end of a logging road that the municipality had half-heartedly gravel-patched and then forgotten. A cedar cabin, single room, wood stove that needed coaxing every morning. She had no neighbors within 2 kilometers. She had satellite internet that dropped whenever the wind came from the northwest. She had a rescue dog named Ghost, a Belgian Malinois, with a brindle coat, one torn ear from a training incident, and a disposition that most people described, charitably, as complicated. Ghost had been retired from a Joint Task Force 2 unit after his handler was killed during a training accident outside Petawawa. The forces had tried to rehome him twice. The first family lasted 11 days. The second, a retired MP in Trenton, had returned him after Ghost put a hole in his living room wall. A welfare officer had emailed Leila because she was on a short list. Former Special Operations Canine Handler, no dependents, rural address. She had driven 14 hours to pick him up without asking a single question about what he was like. She already knew what he was like. She knew because she was the same. That first winter, the two of them existed in the cabin like survivors of something neither one could name. Ghost slept at the foot of her cot. She woke at 3 in the morning and he was already watching the door. She didn't tell him it was fine. He didn't pretend to believe her. They fed each other in the only way two damaged things can, by staying close and asking nothing. The mainland called, sometimes, her mother from a landline in Sudbury, leaving voicemails that always ended the same way. "Leila, we're worried. Just call us back." Her former commanding officer sent a single email, 2 lines, no reply required. A physiotherapist in Prince Rupert had a standing appointment she had cancelled 4 times. She didn't go to any of it. The morning it all changed, the weather had been building for 3 days. A low-pressure system off the Alaskan Panhandle, the kind the island got 6 or 7 times a winter, had pushed walls of horizontal rain down from the north. Leila had last driven into Massé, the closest town, 6 days ago for propane and rice. She had spoken to the woman at the hardware counter, whose name she had never learned, for approximately 40 seconds. She was splitting wood behind the cabin when Ghost started. Not barking. Ghost rarely barked. He made a sound low in his chest, a vibration more felt than heard, and his body dropped into the stance she had learned to read. Weight forward, ears pinned, tail absolutely still. Not aggression. Assessment. She set the axe down slowly. Her right hand found the grip of the Leatherman at her belt, old habit, and she moved around the corner of the cabin. A pickup truck had stopped at the end of the road. Old Ford, dented wheel arch, northern BC plates. The driver was standing beside it, not approaching, hands visible. A woman, late 40s, broad-shouldered, dark hair pulled back under a rain jacket hood. She was watching Leila the way someone watches a dog they're not sure about. Smart. "I'm looking for Leila Voss," the woman called over the wind. Ghost moved half a step forward. Leila set her hand on his shoulder. "You found her. My name is Carolyn Tate. I'm a nurse at Queen Charlotte Islands General. We spoke briefly. You came in about 14 months ago. Head laceration. You left before we could discharge you properly." Leila remembered. She had stitched it herself in the end. 3 sutures, butterfly tape. Good enough. I didn't need anything. "That's not actually why I'm here." Carolyn kept her hands open, unhurried. She had the particular stillness of someone who spent their professional life walking into rooms where people were afraid or in pain. "I'm here because of a man named Owen Beaumont." The name hit Leila somewhere behind the sternum. She didn't move. She didn't breathe wrong. She had been trained for exactly this, to receive information without showing its weight. But Ghost felt it through her hand on his shoulder, the small involuntary tightening, and he turned his head slightly to look up at her. Owen Beaumont had been Ghost's first handler. He had been her teammate. He had died 14 months ago in a training accident outside CFB Petawawa when a rappelling system failed during a nighttime exercise. The inquiry had taken 8 months. The findings had been distributed to the relevant parties. Layla had read the report in a parking lot in Prince Rupert and driven the rest of the way home without stopping. The official finding was mechanical failure, equipment not properly inspected, a chain of procedural errors. What the report did not say, what no report ever said, was that Layla had been the one who had signed off on that equipment check. She had been the senior NCO on rotation that night. She had looked at the harness and the rigging, initialed the clipboard, and moved on to the next item. She had been distracted. She had been running on 4 hours of sleep and a disagreement with her CO that she couldn't shake. She had looked and she had not actually seen, and Owen Beaumont, who was 31 years old and had a daughter in kindergarten in Pembroke, had gone off that cliff in the dark. Carolyn was still standing by her truck in the rain. "What about him?" Layla said. Her voice came out flat and controlled, which was all she could manage. "His wife, his widow. Her name is Sophie Beaumont. She's been living in Prince Rupert for the past year, working at the Marine Supply Depot." Carolyn paused. She reached out to the hospital last month because she needed information about connecting with other CF families in the region. "I run a small group, informal, spouses, parents, people who've lost someone." Another pause, shorter. She mentioned Owen. She mentioned his dog. She didn't know where Ghost had gone after rehoming fell through the first 2 times. Leela said nothing. "I'd been asking around quietly. A welfare officer I know told me you had him." Carolyn looked at Ghost. The Malinois was absolutely still, watching her with amber eyes that gave nothing away. "She's not asking you for anything, Ms. Voss. Sophie doesn't know I'm here. I'm here because I thought—" She stopped, started again, more carefully. "I thought you might want to know she exists." Leela picked up her axe. "I appreciate the drive." Carolyn stood in the rain for a moment longer. Then she nodded once, got back in her truck, and turned it around on the gravel. Ghost watched the truck until its taillights disappeared into the tree line. Then he looked back at the door of the cabin and waited for Layla to follow him inside. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on her cot with Ghost pressed against her legs and stared at the ceiling and thought about the name Sophie Beaumont the way you press a bruise, not to understand it, just to confirm it still hurts. She knew Sophie the way you know someone from a photograph at a memorial service. Owen had kept a picture tucked inside the front cover of whatever novel he was reading, cycling the same small collection of paperbacks. The picture was his wife and daughter outside what looked like a hardware store, both squinting into summer light. He had shown it to Lila once, without preamble, in the middle of a gear check, holding it up and saying, "Her name's Sophie. Married up, is what I'm saying." Lila had laughed. She hadn't been in the habit of laughing easily, but Owen had that effect. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and breathed through it. In the morning, she fed Ghost, split the remaining wood, and drove into Massey for propane and a phone signal strong enough to run a search. Sophie Beaumont, Prince Rupert, BC, the Marine Supply Depot on Cow Bay Road. She found the business listing, the address, the hours. She sat in her truck in the parking lot of the hardware store with the engine running and the wipers going, and looked at the information on her phone screen for a long time. Then she drove home. She did this 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. Drive to town, find the address, sit with it, drive home. Ghost went with her each time. He sat in the passenger seat with his head braced against the window and watched the wet road go past with the patience of a creature that had learned, the hard way, that motion didn't always mean arrival. The 4th time she didn't turn around. She took the ferry to Prince Rupert in early February, aboard a BC Ferries vessel that smelled of diesel and wet wool, and she stood on the outer deck in the cold with Ghost on a short lead and watched the mainland come up through the fog. The crossing took 6 hours. She ate a granola bar at hour 3. Ghost refused the piece she offered him, which she understood. She found the depot on Cow Bay Road at 2:30 in the afternoon. Marine hardware, commercial grade. The kind of place that smelled of rope and grease and the particular mix of salt and rust that belonged to working waterfronts. She sat in the truck across the street for 20 minutes. Then she got out. She clipped Ghost's lead. She walked toward the entrance. The woman behind the counter was stacking invoices into a wire tray, mid-30s, dark circles under her eyes, hair in a low bun, wearing a blue vest over a flannel shirt. She looked up when the door opened, and her eyes went immediately to Ghost. She went completely still. Not afraid. Something else. Ghost. And this was the thing Layla would think about afterward, for a long time. Ghost made a sound, not the low, warning vibration. Something different. A sound she had never heard from him in 2 years. Short and quiet, almost uncertain, like a question. Sophie Beaumont came around the counter slowly. She crouched down at Ghost's level, which was not something most people would think to do, which meant she had been around working dogs before. Her hand came up, not reaching but offering, palm up, fingers loose. Ghost looked at Lila. Lila said nothing. He stepped forward and pressed his nose into Sophie's palm. Sophie's face did something that Lila had to look away from. Not because it was ugly. Because it was too much of everything at once. Grief and recognition, and something that had no good word, the face of someone being handed something they had stopped believing they would ever receive. "He remembers," Sophie said softly. "He was trained to read people," Layla said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "He doesn't forget anyone he's worked with." She paused. "Owen worked with him for 2.5 years. Sophie nodded, still crouching, her hand moving slowly through Ghost's brindled fur. The dog stood without tension, which was something Layla had never seen from him with a stranger. Not once. "I tried to find out what happened to him," Sophie said. "After the rehoming fell through the second time, they stopped returning my calls. She wasn't accusing, just explaining. I thought he'd been placed somewhere I couldn't find. He was with me, I know." Sophie looked up. "The nurse, Carolyn, she told me you came, that you'd driven over." A pause. "She called me 2 days ago." So Carolyn had called her anyway. Layla filed that away and said nothing. Sophie straightened up slowly. She was a few inches shorter than Lila, and she had the posture of someone who had been carrying something heavy. For so long they had forgotten it wasn't supposed to be permanent. "Can I get you something? Coffee? We have a back room." "I'm not staying," Lila said. And then, because she had driven 6 hours and crossed a piece of open ocean and was standing here instead of at home where everything was manageable. "I came because I needed to tell you something." Sophie waited. Layla had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it on the ferry, and in the truck, and in the half-sleeping hours before dawn in the cabin. She had the words in the right order. She knew what she meant to say. What came out was, "I signed the equipment check." The depot was very quiet. The fluorescent light overhead hummed. Ghost sat between them, one ear forward, one back. "I was the NCO on rotation," Layla continued, "because stopping now would be worse. I initialed the clipboard. The harness assembly, the failure point, I looked at it. I didn't look properly. She stopped. Started again. I was tired and I was distracted, and I moved on to the next item, and I should not have. I have read the inquiry report 87 times, and nowhere in it does it say my name, because the finding was equipment failure. And that is technically accurate, but it is not the whole truth, and I have been—" She stopped. Ghost pressed his shoulder against her leg. She breathed. "I have been living with that on Haida Gwaii," she said, "with your husband's dog for 14 months, and I came here because I don't know what else to do with it except tell you." Sophie Beaumont looked at her for a long moment. long enough that the fluorescent light seemed to hum louder, long enough that Lila's hands, which she had kept very still at her side, started to feel strange. Then Sophie said, "Owen talked about you." Lila said nothing. "He talked about you a lot, actually. You and Ghost, the team." Sophie's voice was careful, not cold, choosing each word the way you choose footholds on uncertain ground. "He said you were the most meticulous person on the unit. He said you ran gear checks like your life depended on them, because it usually did." She paused. "He also said you hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night since the Kandahar deployment, and that the CO was riding you so hard you were basically running on reflex." Lila stared at her. "He called me 3 days before the accident," Sophie said. "He was worried about you. Not about the mission, not about the exercise, about you specifically." She took a breath. "He said someone needs to tell Layla to stop, but no one's going to, so she's going to break herself before anyone notices." The words landed in a place Layla had been protecting for 14 months. "That doesn't change what I did," Layla said, and her voice barely held. "No," Sophie agreed, "it doesn't." She came a step closer. "But you want to know something about the report, the actual finding, equipment failure. Do you know who else signed off on that same equipment in the previous rotation?" Layla didn't answer. 3 people, Sophie said. "I read every page. I had a lawyer read it. 3 people initialed that same harness assembly across 2 rotations, and the failure point was a manufacturing defect in the cam buckle that was not visible during standard inspection. The inquiry board knew this. They did not say it clearly, because that would have implicated the supplier and the procurement process, and that was a much longer conversation than the forces wanted to have." Her voice was steady, not hard. Steady in the way of someone who had already screamed all of this at a wall in private many months ago, and now had nothing left but the facts. "You were not the only person who looked at that harness. You were not the only person who didn't see what wasn't there to be seen." Ghost had not moved. He was watching Sophie with the same focused attention he gave to anything he was still deciding about. "I have been so angry," Sophie said quietly, "for a long time at the forces, at the board, at the supplier, at the process, at Owen sometimes for volunteering for night exercises when he didn't have to." She exhaled. "But I have never been angry at you. I didn't even know your name until Carolyn mentioned it, and when I found out..." She shook her head. "You took his dog. You took Ghost when no one else would. You've been caring for him for over a year. That wasn't..." Layla started. "I know it wasn't absolution," Sophie said. "I know you weren't doing it for that. That's the thing." She looked at Ghost, who was leaning now, almost imperceptibly, toward Sophie's knee. "You did it because he needed someone. That's just who you are." Layla looked at the floor. The concrete was worn smooth near the counter, scuffed near the door. There was a smear of marine grease near the base of a shelving unit. She focused on these things because if she looked up, she was not going to hold her face together, and she had not held her face together in front of another person since 2019. Ghost made the small, uncertain sound again. Then he stood up and pushed his head against Layla's hip with enough force that she had to shift her weight. She put her hand on him, gripped the coarse fur at his scruff, the way she did in the small hours when the dark got too loud. "His daughter," Layla said. Her voice was barely there. "Owen's daughter!" "How old is she now?" 6, Sophie said. "Her name is Ivy. She started grade 1 in September." A pause. "She has his laugh. It's almost not fair how much she has his laugh." Layla closed her eyes. For a moment, the depot was very still. The hum of the light, the distant sound of the waterfront, the weather working at the corners of the building. 2 women and a dog who had all been moving around the same absence for more than a year, arriving, finally, at the same room. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks over," Sophie said softly. "It's good. They do a dark roast from a place in Smithers. Ghost can come. The owner has 3 dogs." She said it simply, not pushing, the way you open a door and stand back. "If you want." Layla opened her eyes. She looked at Ghost, who was looking at Sophie with his ears forward. his tail making one slow sweep across the concrete floor. In 2 years, Layla had never seen him wag his tail. She thought about the cabin at the end of the logging road, the wood stove that needed coaxing, the satellite internet that dropped in northwest wind, the 3 in the morning wakefulness and the door ghost watched, and the silence she had crossed an ocean of grief to find. She thought about Owen Beaumont in a parking lot in Pembroke, holding up a photograph. Her name's Sophie. Married up is what I'm saying. And the sound of her own laugh, unbidden and real, in the middle of a gear check. She clipped Ghost's lead. 1 cup, she said. Sophie nodded and reached for her jacket, and Ghost walked between them through the door and into the cold Prince Rupert afternoon, and the waterfront smelled of salt and diesel and the particular brine of the North Pacific, and somewhere in the fog above Cow Bay the ravens were calling, and Layla Voss, for the first time in 14 months, did not walk toward the sound of things ending.